Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's Ian Allinson. I'm the president of Manchester Trades Council. I'll be trying to chair today's session. But behind the scenes, we've got Annette Wright, also from the Trades Council, who'll be sorting out speakers later on. And then we've got John Pye, Norma Turner, John Morgan, and Evan Pritchard sorting out all the technicalities. So they're doing all the hard work behind the scenes. Obviously, this is a very unusual May Day. We've had to go online, but nonetheless, we've got an absolutely amazing lineup of speakers. And despite the dark days that we're in, where many of us are losing family members, friends, workmates and comrades, it's right to celebrate International Workers' Day and to take inspiration from it to redouble our efforts. The importance of workers has been really highlighted by the crisis. It's workers that are keeping the world moving on, but it's also highlighted many issues, the nature of insecure work and inadequate financial security, overcrowded housing, all contributing to the spread of coronavirus. So workers' collective action is essential to win safe working for essential workers, to close down non-essential work and to win financial support to make all that possible. And that collective action is taking many forms. We've had the phenomenal growth of mutual aid groups. Salford TUC, one of our sister trades councils locally, is working with the Street Meat Soup Kitchen to help cope with the increasing number of people who just haven't got enough food to eat. And we're grateful to the other trades councils of Greater Manchester for supporting today's event. But the coronavirus pandemic also highlights the importance of internationalism. It is, after all, a global pandemic. The dynamics of colonialism and imperialism are leaving countries ill-equipped. You may have seen health workers in Pakistan who've been on hunger strike, beaten and tortured by police for demanding treatment for patients and PPE to stop them acting as vectors of transmission. So it shouldn't be social distancing that we're having, but physical distancing and social solidarity to tackle the pandemic. And this will continue to be important once the current crisis is over. We'll still face a climate crisis that's evolving fast, an economy in absolute turmoil, and no doubt the rich and powerful will seek to use that to their advantage and at our expense. And collective organisation is, after all, our weapon. So, as well as the wonderful speakers, a few practicalities. The meeting's been recorded and live streamed. Details of how to share the live stream on Facebook will be posted in the chat box if they haven't been already. And there'll be other useful information during the course of the event will be posted in the chat box. My co-chairs will be posting in capitals so their messages stand out, and just to be clear, that doesn't mean they're shouting at you, it's just so that you can see their messages. And if it becomes distracting, which it sometimes can during large meetings, Annette will turn the chat facility off and on for various periods during the meeting. But later in the meeting, we'll use the chat box to identify participants to speak, and we'll give instructions on how to speak. So that's enough from me, and we'll move on to our first speaker, who is the GP and NHS campaigner, Jackie Grunsell. So over to you, Jackie.
Hi, yes, thanks, Ian. I'll just introduce myself. As Ian said, my name is Jackie Grunsell. I'm a GP and a member of both Doctors in Unite and the BMA. I'm also a member of Socialist Alternative. I think the coronavirus crisis has been significant because it's really shone a light on the frailty of the NHS and social care system, in fact, all public services, in the run-up to and during this crisis. And really, it's underlined the problems of decades of underfunding, staff shortages, cuts, privatisation of services which have massively taken their toll. So that the starting point for this crisis was that we had 100,000 staff shortages across the NHS, significantly fewer critical care beds per head of population than most other European or developed countries internationally, and a social care service that's been cut to the bone and privatised with no slack in the system, the whole health and social care system really straining at capacity already and not in a fit state to cope with the increased pressure of a mismanaged pandemic, because this was not an inevitable crisis. It's a crisis. It's become more of a crisis than it needed to be, because we've had a government that has not prepared adequately, had a complacent attitude at the start, and put out contradictory advice week after week over mask wearing, who should and shouldn't isolate themselves, what PPE should be used, who to test, and the list goes on. And on the issue of inadequate personal protective equipment, then the government have changed its policy a number of times as to what was needed, and been unable to provide what was needed, even on their standards, and therefore have completely lost the trust of health workers in the strategy that they have pursued. In addition, the lack of testing, which, if implemented properly at the very start of this, could have been the key to preventing infection spread and ultimately reducing the death rate, has been a major problem for everyone, and for healthcare workers in particular. But on all of these issues where the system has not been up to the challenge, a large factor has been the fact that private companies have been providing and distributing resources and services, rather than workers themselves being in control of the decision making and the planning process. And the government have shown contempt for workers, actually, despite standing on Downing Street and clapping, by allowing non-essential companies to stay open, not providing 100% pay protection for workers who were unable to work, and then inevitably forcing people to go into work in order to pay their bills and risk spreading the virus further. And it's only where workers have come together and insisted that employers implement measures to ensure social distancing that that's happened, and not through any action of this government. In some cases, we've had workers who have had to refuse to work due to lack of PPE or lack of social distancing measures. And I would say I'm really pleased, Dave Ward's here, postal workers are a section of workers who have managed to get an element of control over working conditions in these issues. And that's possibly why the employer are now going for them in the way that they are, with proposed cuts at this stage. I just want to express solidarity with the postal workers. I think one of the things this crisis has also shone a light on is who are the real key workers, who is keeping our society running and making the wealth in this economy. And that's why it's such a disgrace that the attacks on postal workers are happening now, and potentially are a sign of things to come in terms of this government wanting to make workers pay the price of this crisis in the future. Postal workers dispute coming up is critical. It's the first major national dispute of this period, and a victory for them would be an important signal to the rest of the trade union and labour movement of what's possible and the need to fight back. I think it's really vital that we collectively do everything we can to ensure victory and not leave the CWU to fight alone. And we would,
Jackie,
I mean,
you've just got 30 seconds left.
I would say practically, you know, it's great we've had the clap for carers, but we could turn that into something more positive. It should be a clap for postal workers as well. Something maybe the Trades Council and we should do as a whole is produce window posters for people to display, hold up during the claps, highlight the issues and grow public support for the posties. Physical protests are still possible, respecting social distancing, and we should try to organise those in support of the dispute. And finally, Socialist Alternative are back on the NHS, are calling for a massive demonstration to defend the NHS once this lockdown is over. We need to build that as soon as possible.
Thanks very much for that. That's really appreciated.
All right, thanks.
Lots of food for thought there from the NHS front line, and as Jackie mentioned, Dave Ward from the Communication Workers Union, our next speaker, postal workers in particular have really been in the thick of it, both having to take collective action to ensure their safety. So over to you, Dave.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks, Jackie, for those words, and solidarity to everybody listening. It's great to have an invite to speak at the Manchester May Day Festival. Love to have been in Manchester, back in the Mechanics Centre, the birthplace of the union movement. So, yeah, it's great. So let me just say we've actually had a victory yesterday, because our employer had decided to take advantage of the pandemic. We've got an ongoing dispute about the future of the industry, and the employer had decided that it was going to change the universal service. From our perspective, it looked very much like a permanent change. It was said to be a temporary change because of the pressure on workers with sickness levels and stuff like that. And we understood that to a degree, but the terms that they wanted to push forward with were terms where they were changing whole-scale duties right across the country. And I'm pleased to say that as a result of our members sticking with the union, we made it very clear to Royal Mail, to the government, to the regulator, that we were not going to accept the proposals that Royal Mail put forward. And as a result of that, we got an agreement yesterday where the changes will be for a very minimum period. Both the government and Royal Mail and the regulator actually have all confirmed that it is definitely temporary. We'll be going back to a 6-day USO in 6 weeks. In the meantime, all the duty changes are going to be voluntary, and if there are any changes, they're going to be negotiated with our local union reps. And so it was an all-round major climb down by the company. We've still got an ongoing dispute with Royal Mail, and they've agreed as a result of our actions, collective actions, that we're now going to sit down and talk about the overall dispute. So it was great to be able to see that happening. I want to talk about sort of, first of all, making sense of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then setting out an agenda for all workers really going forward, and what the role of the trade union movement is within that. So the first thing I would say is that my own feelings about this are very mixed. One day you feel very sad about the tragic human cost of this. Very difficult to get some of these stories out of your mind. One that I still remember every day is 2 twin sisters in the NHS who died, both of them, giving up their lives, saving lives of others. And all of the NH workers and care workers, the bus drivers, our own members, workers right across the piece who have died during this pandemic. Then there's anger, and Jackie touched on some of that, which is around the lack of preparation. The reality that, we can't even, as a country, because of the political and economic forces that have been in place for decades now, we can't even supply the basics. We couldn't even prepare properly for hand sanitizers, gloves and masks. We've got to ask, why that is. Why has the country come to that position? Why do we have to, rely on big crates coming from China when we didn't have the capacity in the UK to actually supply those things? That's a long-term problem that has to be tackled. But I'm also, some of those deaths are avoidable. That's the anger, and it's their lack of PPE. Our members stood firm on some of that, and they've got the supplies. Sometimes we have to keep doing that, but our members will always deal with that problem by collective action in the workplace. But then there's the inspiring part. And I would say that a new mood, a new respect for workers, the likes of which I've not seen in my working life. And there's one common denominator with all of those key workers, including our own members, the NHS workers, care workers, emergency service workers, shop workers. The great job that shop workers have done, transport workers. There's one common denominator. All of the workers we now value the most in society are all at either the average or lower end of the pay scales. And we can't let that continue. So I think there's 3 things I would say, 3 questions that I would pose. One is how do we create, on top of this new spirit, new models of collectivism, of people beginning to realise that it's collectivism that will change the values in society, not the politicians. It's what we do as working class people in terms of our collective force. How do we take the New Deal for Workers campaign forward? This is fundamental to what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months. And I'm going to set that out shortly on how we do that. And how do we effectively create a new normal? Now, we've got major challenges coming up. There's going to be an economic fallout of this crisis, and you're already seeing that. The disgraceful actions of BA. I was talking to Len McCluskey this morning. I mean, this is shocking stuff, you know, where a company has refused support from the state and then has gone on to basically sack 12,000, I think it's probably going to get up to 20,000 workers. But what Len said to me as well was it's a return to the dispute that they had many years ago with BA, where even for the workers that are still there, their terms and conditions are being attacked. So it's the agenda of that old BA boss, Willie Walsh, who now sits as the chief executive of the company that owns BA, the international company. This is going to be an agenda that a lot of employers will seek to take advantage of. So we're going to have to deal with the economic fallout. We'll have to deal with it, as Jackie said, along with climate change. And we're going to have to deal with it along with the reality, and nobody should forget this, that we are on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution. Artificial intelligence, digitalization, whole new worlds of technology are coming towards workers rapidly. So what's our solution to this? Well, I think it's for the trade union movement to lead the fight back. I believe that there's going to be no one political party that's going to be able to do that. I think the trade union movement has to take responsibility for leading that fight back. And our New Deal campaign, which I've championed for a number of years now, and I was so pleased to see in some of the May Day celebrations yesterday that many unions are now starting to talk about the New Deal. You know, and I'm going to suggest 4 very simple steps that we could take forward to build the momentum that we need to really change society. So one of them for trade unions is we must agree common bargaining agendas in sectors of the economy. So if you've got 4 or 5 different unions operating within a sector, then let's come together and set out a common bargaining agenda that from now on we are going to take to every employer in that sector to root out low pay, insecure employment models that this particular crisis has highlighted. The second one is we need a new charter, a new style of Bridlington principles that create cooperation between trade unions rather than internal competition to create, you know, what workers go in what union. We need new models of collectivism that support that new cooperation. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about how we can use digital platforms like this to create those new models of collectivism. We need to shape demands that all unions and all workers can get behind. We need to shape those demands around revaluing pay. We need to have the debate in a very simple way, not get bogged down by the economics of it, which after all, I do not believe is a science. It's choices that politicians make. And we need to show in stark contrast, what is it that we value in work that contributes to society, and what should those people be paid? What should their terms and conditions be compared to some of the senior people in the big employers across the UK, who I would argue, not all of them, but quite a lot of them, do not really contribute in the way that perhaps years ago, whether you liked them or you didn't like them, people like Henry Ford was an innovator. He made an absolute fortune, but he created something that the rest of workers benefited from. The manufacturing of cars, and society benefited from. What I see with too many employers today who hold all the aces is that they are not contributing to wider society. They're not coming up with the ideas that are going to create jobs. They just break things up and they get paid lots of money for it because of the cover they had with some of the political and economical systems of privatisation, liberalisation, all of these systems that we know penalise workers. So we need that charter. We need to agree it very quickly. And then finally, we need to take action. We need to come out of this crisis. It's difficult. We've got a bit of time here to think through what could be new forms of collective action that all of the people that are out on the street clapping, whether they're in a union at the moment or not, can actually be part of going forward in order to change society. So I'll finish by saying, I think there's opportunities in every crisis, and we have a responsibility. This is the first time for many of us in our lifetime where, rather than the sacrifices of the generations of the past, the people who fought the fascists, the suffragettes, the Tolpuddle martyrs, the match girls strike, all of these great traditions, the miners' strikes, we now know that people have made sacrifices today. And our job going forward now is to launch and fight for a new deal for workers. And as part of that, we will create a new normal in society. Thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks very much, Dave. Lots of food for thought there for everybody. Next up, we've got Ameen Hadi, who's the chair of Unison's Northwest Black Members Committee. Really important to hear such a voice when we know that Black people are being so disproportionately affected by the impact of coronavirus. So over to you, Ameen.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. Right, International Workers' Day is the day that trade unionists and socialists renew our commitment to fight for a better world. The deadly man-made virus sweeping across the planet, the need for fight for such a world where people come before profits has never felt more relevant. Capitalism is sick. That doesn't mean that I've learned a new youth vernacular. I genuinely mean old-style sick. Hundreds of thousands of us are being killed with leaders of the world feigning concern while desperate to get back to business as usual. Workers, particularly those with poor health, have been wiped out in their thousands and treated as collateral damage. It's highlighted how much the establishment and big business are willing to go to put their profits before our lives. Remember, this is the system when we demonstrated outside the G8 20 years ago against the fact that millions die from lack of food, clean water and shelter. And what did they do? They tear gassed us and shot at us. This is a system when in our millions we demonstrated across the world to stop the slaughter of millions of innocent people in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Solely for oil, power and profits, they ignored us. And we are seeing the never-ending so-called war on terror, or should I more actually call it a war of terror? Because when we marched at the time, we knew that war would only lead to more wars, not peace. Poverty and wars led millions to be displaced, trying to find some safety in the world. Across the world, we've organised campaigns for solidarity with refugees and popularised the slogan that refugees are welcome here. What has the establishment done to those refugees? With the sick system that forced them to leave their homes in the first place. It's vilified them, it's called them cockroaches, it's dehumanised them, it's called them terrorists, and scapegoated them for the lack of resources or access to healthcare and housing. The European Union has created a mass grave in the Mediterranean with over 30,000 known dead. And Donald Trump, a friend to white supremacists, has put parents and children in cages on the US border. Let's be clear, refugees, Muslims or migrants are not responsible for zero-hour contracts, the need for millions to use food banks, the homelessness that's going up and up, or this virus. This bullshit is spread by the establishment with the help of the rich friends who control the media. Racism is a worldwide tool used to divide us and distract us from the real enemies of humanity. To add insult to injury, they're trying to blame us for going to a park for spreading the virus. when the blame for the deaths of thousands every day could have been prevented. For herd immunity, read a justification for the disposable nature of our lives to our rulers. To rub it in further, black workers who find themselves in the most dangerous frontline jobs, often due to discrimination, find themselves disproportionately at risk. Remember, these are the same black workers that have been vilified by the media as part of government's hostile environment. Early this week, I listened to a fantastic meeting organised by Stand Up to Racism with the likes of Kevin Courtney, General Secretary of the Teachers Union, Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, all calling for an independent public inquiry into the disproportionate black deaths caused by the virus. Not the whitewash government version headed up by the establishment stooge, Trevor Phillips. This demand the whole trade union movement should unite behind. So when we circulate the parliamentary petition next week, we need to get the signatures to force this debate and force this government into a humiliating climb down. This is something we can win. This demand must go alongside a demand for PPE, test and track. If we're not safe, we're not going back. With this in mind, I'd ask you all to support the call from health activists and people before profit action groups for a day of action this Thursday, where Johnson shares his plan. I took part in a safe social distance protest at Salford Royal on International Workers' Memorial Day, along with protests outside Trafford General, Stepping Hill, North Manchester. These physical protests give our solidarity to health workers and show the wider public that resistance to the system. The government, despite its parliamentary majority, is weak. We are not going back to business as usual. We're not going back to austerity. We're not going to go back to a world where the rich get richer while we get poorer. We're not going to go back to a world where they burn fossil fuels for profit that risks our very existence. We must renew our pledge to fight for a better world and fight for the living. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ameen. That's great. So our next speaker is Bassam as-Salhi, who's the Ramallah-based General Secretary of the Palestinian People's Party and an elected member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. So over to you, Bassam.
Thank you very much. Dear comrades, brothers and sisters, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, our friends, Unison, Unite, and TUC, and to share our thoughts, especially in the International Labour Day. It is the day of solidarity between all workers of the world. It is the day which we have to always remember and to keep alive for the struggle against capitalism and the policies of the new liberal market economy. These policies do not take into consideration the working class interests or social protection rights. I would like to express my solidarity Is it okay now? Like camera?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. I would like to express my solidarity with UK citizens and the working class in their fight against COVID-19. This situation shows clearly that capitalism and businesses do not care about people, and the only thing they care about is profit. I also would like to salute the UK NHS staff, doctors and nurses, and all people who put their lives at risk to help people, and in particular the workers. The working class in Palestine and the world commemorates the 1st of May, the International Labour Day, under extremely harsh and complicated circumstances due to the exploitation and racism accumulated by capitalism and its most brutal and violent manifestations in its neoliberal version, which led impoverishment of people, theft of most of the gains of social protection and healthcare, to increase the class gaps, devoted the dominance of the financial capital and military industry complexes, led to sabotage of the environment and nature, and continue to monopolize the wealth, food, economic, and health resources. Palestinian people still struggle for self-determination and to end the occupation. The Israeli occupation continue to confiscate lands and build settlements on the Palestinian people's land, and does all that is possible to prevent any possibility of two-state solution to the conflict. Israeli occupation continues its arrest policies. As of today, there is over 6,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, including children and women. In addition to the continuous occupation measures, with the so-called deal of the century, plan to annex vast majority of the Palestinian territories' land, with the full support of the United States government against Palestinian people aspiration and also against international resolutions. We should not forget the continuous closure of the Gaza Strip for over 13 years, which resulted in the death of thousands of Palestinian people. We also witnessed the violation and attacks against Palestinian workers who work in Israel. Israeli authorities force Palestinian workers to pay a compulsory trade union membership fees in addition to other several deductions without any benefits or protections, simply because they are not an Israeli citizen. It's forbidden for Palestinian lawyers or trade unions to represent or defend Palestinian workers. Recently, with the outbreak of COVID-19, the Israeli Occupation Authority refrained from providing treatment to any Palestinian workers diagnosed with the virus.
Just 30 seconds more, please. Thank you.
On the contrary, they moved them and threw them in Palestinian controlled areas. In many cases, Palestinian Authority is not allowed to act in the area in West Bank called Area C. In Palestine, we marked the 1st of May while we are under lockdown. Our working class continues the struggle in different fronts. We continue the struggle against the Israeli occupation and aggression for the independence of self-determination and the Palestinian people, similar to all people in the world, in one hand, and on the other hand, as all continues, we have conflict and interest because the Palestinian Authority adopted the market economy policies against the worker interest.
So thanks very much, Bassam. And it's an important reminder that struggles that were going on before before coronavirus are still very much present and continuing. So our next speaker is Penny Hicks from Manchester People's Assembly. So over to you, Penny.
Thank you very much, Ian, and a really big thank you to Manchester Trades Council for putting on this event and carrying on with your mission to always have a great event in Manchester for International Workers' Day. And also thank you for the support you give the People's Assembly day in, day out over the years of austerity that we've struggled against. And for all of us here, I think, enjoying this meeting is the fact that austerity now has been exposed in such a great and appalling effect. When Boris Johnson fell ill and we were told the virus doesn't discriminate, and the press loved that. We knew it did, but the proof where people who come from poorer communities are more likely to die of the virus because of poorer health facilities, poorer housing, poorer terms and conditions at work, all the combination factors of austerity coming together has meant quite clearly that poorer people are more likely to fall more seriously ill and die of the virus. That in lockdown, the people who are living in cramped accommodations, sharing rooms, sharing hostels, the homeless, they're just having such a dreadful time trying to cope with it, that it very clearly does discriminate. And for the People's Assembly, one of our greatest challenges, I guess for many activists here, is how we make our voice heard against this massive mishandling of a crisis. It's criminal. I mean, you know, Dave, the CWU has supported the People's Assembly massively and stream our events, for which we're very grateful. And one of the things I think about the online world we've turned to is, although it's passive and we are more consumers, I think a lot of people are spending a lot more time listening to arguments, experienced speakers and things and ideas that they perhaps haven't heard before or had the time to engage with. So one, you know, small positive thing perhaps by lockdown. But also what I wanted to talk about was how we make our voice heard against austerity. And what Ameen Hadi said, there'll be no return to austerity, has to be for us the major rallying cry. No return to normal. The New Deal for workers that you talk about in the CWU, absolutely. I mean, the trade unions I know are working their socks off with more cases, with bosses and abusing the furlough
30
rule.
seconds, please, Penny.
And with increased, and the silver lining is increased membership. So next Thursday, the People's Assembly is trying to do a massive takeover of social media, 6:30. All the organisations we're partners with will be streaming the event, and we want to try and make it the biggest coming together online that we've seen so far. So please do join us, put posters up, and let's stay as active as we can.
Thanks very much, Penny. The next speaker is Alison Treacher, who's actually my own Unite branch secretary, but also a care worker. And care workers have been one of the groups that several speakers referred to, you know, at the bottom end of many issues of employment, but really playing an absolutely vital role that's been highlighted by the current crisis. So, Alison.
Thanks so much, Ian. I've worked in social care my whole adult life. Healthcare assistants, carers, support workers and personal assistants have all been on the front line of this pandemic. Every day, the crisis has been both physically and mentally draining. Supporting and reassuring others when your own life has been turned upside down by anxiety has been a daily challenge. It takes remarkable people to do this with love in their hearts. For years, the care sector has been privatised, outsourced, underfunding and deprofessionalised. Just weeks before the crisis, Tory ministers described us as unskilled labour, and we haven't forgotten it. This government's inaction is damning. Carers have been subject to both shortages and substandard PPE, resulting in some carers having to buy their own protection. We have been faced with an unacceptable choice to choose between work and our own health. Testing has been painfully slow and many still unable to access testing centres. We've been terrified to go to work as we could be asymptomatic, hurting the very people we're supposed to be caring for. Now whistleblowers are being victimised for speaking out against negligent employers, stress and anxiety, and most of all, loss. This pandemic reminds us of what is really important in crisis, which is saving and sustaining life. Yet this Tory government is only concerned with protecting capitalism. More than 3/4 of the workforce considered to be at high risk during this pandemic are women. Of the full-time workers working in high-risk jobs and being paid poverty wages, 98% of those are women. The majority of them are carers. Women disproportionately do the unsafe, emotional, badly paid work of care and reproduction, the very work that keeps our society functioning. It is not right that those on the front line, most exposed to COVID-19, providing services to care for your loved ones, are at the highest risk, earning so little. Many across the sector won't even qualify for full sick pay from their employer, leaving them struggling to pay bills and keep a roof over their head. Arundhati Roy described this pandemic as a portal where we leave the baggage of the old world behind us and we choose a different path to navigate our future. We must leave the baggage of neoliberalism, which elevates the need for bosses' profits over the value of the work that carers undertake. We must leave the patriarchal norms which force women to take on the lion's share of responsibility whilst leaving us on poverty wages to struggle both at work and at home. I'll just finish the sentence. Is that cool? Yeah. Okay, cheers. And we must leave the labels of unskilled and demand the respect and pay we deserve. We must leave the invisibility of unpaid carers to shine a light on their unseen labour, which so many people rely on to survive. We must leave the models of care which are criminally underfunded, leaving those we walk alongside powerless in their choices, and we must demand a new way where individuals are at the heart of their own destiny. The future must be different, and we'll need every voice in the labour movement to stand with us to amplify our fight for justice. A reimagining of the way that we value work is necessary.
Thanks,
The old world, the status quo, and the disdain for carers and the work that we do must be the final death of this pandemic.
Thanks very much, Alison. That's powerful stuff. Our next speaker, we've got Janet Newsham from the Greater Manchester Hazard Centre, who've been campaigning on safety issues for many, many years, but clearly have come to the forefront in the current crisis. Janet.
Very much. I'm really pleased to join you this afternoon and congratulate the organisers on this brilliant May Day event and bring solidarity greetings from Greater Manchester Hazards and the Hazards campaign. We're a health and safety campaigning organisation supporting, advising and working alongside trade union reps, workers and the families of those who've been killed at work. And I'd also like to record our thanks to all those safety reps out there who are continuing to work hard to keep their members safe. Lots of things that we talk passionately about in the health and safety movement are now suddenly become the topic of conversation to the population in general, MPs and even the media. Things like PPE, the standards of face masks, protective clothing, and how it's reported, RIDOR and who and how it's reported, and the higher risks to low paid vulnerable workers on precarious contracts. Health and safety is about life and death. It's about the loved ones, our loved ones dying, being made ill, injured or surviving with a mental or physical disability. It's also about corrupt and dangerous employers, politicians and scientists securing their profits and a neoliberal agenda at the expense of lives. We witness many employers who've killed through negligence, who exposed their workers to diseases, chemicals, substances, or place them in dangerous or life-threatening conditions, or like the Grenfell Tower fire, which showed where governments have made our health and safety enforcement bodies impotent through savage cuts to resources and changed how they're allowed to work. The COVID-19 situation is no different. So we come to the pandemic with two aims. The first is to ensure the health, safety and welfare of workers, the community and our families. And the second is to hold those in charge, the politicians, employers, enforcement bodies to account, and to make sure that safety of lives is paramount. Professor Andy Watterson says, workers' health is public health. We have decades of austerity and soul-destroying workplaces which treat their workers as disposable. Care workers not paid even for the minimum wage for all the hours that they're expected to be caring in a caring accommodation, having to wait for hours between jobs and with no pay for travel, or cleaners paid by the hour, and in some places having to roam the street to be waited to be called on an app. The COVID-19 pandemic has showed all this up and shown where the most important jobs that our society needs in crisis. We have to make sure that workers' lives are never again regarded as disposable, that those who make decisions are scrutinised, their decisions transparent, and they're held to account for their failings. On this May Day, we pledge that we will unite for a better, healthier and safer future for all workers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janet. Just to highlight, Norma, one of my co-chairs, is doing a great job posting things in the chat box during the different speakers who's speaking and different events and so on. And I can see Hilda Palmer's also posted a lot of information about what the Greater Manchester Hazard Centre is doing in there. Norma's posted details of as well of Manchester Trades Council's been working with the Hazard Centre and others to set up the Manchester Coronavirus Workforce Coronavirus Support Group, and there's a link there for anyone who's interested. Next up, we have Francisco Dominguez, who's the Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign.
Thank you very much. Congratulations to the organisers. It's such an important, next day after International Workers' Day. these kind of meetings are absolutely essential, and I'm delighted to have been invited to it to tell you briefly about the situation in Venezuela. If there is time later on, I'll be prepared to answer questions on Latin America more broadly, but I'll concentrate exclusively on Venezuela now. As everybody knows, Venezuela has been under siege from the United States. There have been 5 years of horrible US economic sanctions. The whole extraterritorial nature of the US sanctions prevents Venezuela from obtaining even the most minimal things, such as, for example, food, medicine, and health inputs, which are essential to fight the pandemic. To make it worse, the United States is expanding and intensifying its attacks on Venezuela right in the middle of the pandemic, which is criminally disgusting. Actually, when you read the United Nations Charter, these kind of attacks constitute a crime against humanity, because what the United States are doing are jeopardizing the life of 32 million people in Venezuela. And this cannot take place. Just to give you a couple of figures of what this means. Between 2017 and 2019, as a result of the sanctions, 40,000 Venezuelans died unnecessarily. 90,000 Venezuelans suffering from HIV find it very difficult, because the government buys the medicines, to get drugs specialized for them. There are 50,000 patients on dialysis, and they cannot get treatment because it's impossible or very difficult for Venezuela to obtain the required implements and medicines and so forth. And then there are 4 million patients who are hypertense, who are also suffering the consequences of this. What is extraordinary in this context is that Venezuela has been able to fight the pandemic very successfully. This obviously has been suppressed in the media almost totally. What it is this: as soon as the news broke out of the pandemic, President Maduro and the government of Venezuela took immediate steps to flatten out the curve, as the say goes. And as a result of that, they mobilized a huge amount of grassroots organizations and the huge public services that they have. Even though they're facing tremendous difficulties, the number of people contaminated with COVID-19 in Venezuela right now is 339. The number of people who actually died as ever since is only 10. And the problem they have is in Brazil, Ecuador, and Colombia, nothing similar is being done. And worse than that, these governments, right-wing governments, are expanding, are unleashing a way of xenophobia against Venezuelans who are living in those places in order to ensure that they go back so as to expand the contamination. This is a sinister plan. I couldn't imagine that they would be able to do this without the Washington being involved in more than one way in this. So this is extremely important to defend these gains that, despite the difficulties Venezuela has obtained. And there is one particular proposal that we're putting together, and I'll be seeking support from all of these fantastic organizations as soon as possible, and it's this: from the Pope, Francis I, the General Secretary of the United Nations, Josep Borrell, the Foreign Secretary of the European Union, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, MTUC, the World Federation of Trade Unions, and so on and so forth, a huge number of international voices that are demanding not only about Venezuela, but about all the countries that have been subjected to sanctions by the United States, that during the period of the pandemic, the sanctions are lifted so that these countries are able to buy food, medicine, and health input. Seems to me that this is an absolutely important proposal that we want to motivate
30 seconds, Francesco, please.
Get support for in the whole of Europe. In the last 10 seconds or 9 seconds that I have, I'll say this. I think it's extremely important. I'm aware of the tremendous difficulties that migrant workers and migrants in general, particularly of the Latin American kind, are suffering right now because of the pandemic. So if anybody has information as to what can they do, where can they go to get support, to get advice, to get their legal status clarified and so on, I more than welcome that information, because we're working with communities Ecuadorian communities, Colombian communities, Brazilian communities. We are talking about something more than 1 million people that we want to support with the trade unions, and particularly the labor force and the working class here, because nobody else is going to support us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm sure people on here will be able to maybe post some suggestions for different organisations that can provide support locally here in Manchester if people wanting to know about their rights. I know many of the unions have helplines and so on as well. And I'm sure on behalf of everybody, send our solidarity to everybody in Venezuela, in Palestine and all around the world who are struggling against this coronavirus, but also for a more just world. Our next speaker is Sam Mason, who's from the PCS and also an activist with the New Lucas Plan, which campaigns around industrial diversification. And obviously this is an issue that's acquired an extra focus recently, where we've seen pushes to try to get manufacturing to diversify to produce the things we need to tackle the pandemic, but also we're seeing the vulnerability of many other jobs, including jobs like those at British Airways, which are also threatened by the climate crisis as well. So let's hear from Sam.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this May Day event, and solidarity to everybody. I think I should just also add that I'm also a GMB member, so I do like to make that point, because whilst I am an official for PCS, I am an activist in my own right as a trade unionist, and my involvement in the New Lucas Plan is actually done on a personal basis. And I think, as Ian said, the relevance of the New Lucas Plan, the ideas that came out of the former Lucas Aerospace workers, have taken on a very particular prominence in these past weeks, and I'll come to some of that in a minute. But as already been sort of mentioned by quite a few of the speakers, quite clearly the COVID crisis has turned upside down a lot of the perceived logic that we're constantly rammed into us about the logic of the market, the priorities of society and of the economy. And one of those big areas that's been given a huge priority is obviously the defence expenditure, and Trident specifically, but not just Trident, other weapons as well. Now, clearly there's lots of talk about, nothing will ever go back to normal. And I think we need to be careful around some of the statements about nothing going back to normal, because a lot of very normal things are still going on, and particularly around the defence world. There's still £350 billion that is due to be invested in extravagant military projects from the UK, which will clearly be targeting working class peoples across the world, as we're currently still seeing going on in Yemen with the support for the Saudi bombing of the Yemeni working class, who are struggling particularly in the COVID crisis. But what also we have seen on the flip side of that is many things that we thought weren't possible and were told weren't possible just a few weeks ago are suddenly becoming possible. And some of those is around the whole defence diversification discussions, which actually go back several decades, coming out of the New Lucas Aerospace Workers Alternative Plan for their work defending jobs at the Lucas Aerospace factories during the 70s, 50% which were defence contract work, but obviously which were procurement based from government money, so taxpayers' money being spent on behalf of citizens. And I think what we can learn from their experience, we really need to apply to today, because although things like the UK ventilator challenge are seeing some of the defence sector actually engaged in making ventilators on behalf of the government, and there's been a sort of call to arms by Unite to diversify manufacturing to produce some of the PPE, etc. Clearly those are not going to be lasting once we start to come out of this crisis. So we need to ensure how we can use those ideas that came up through the Lucas Aerospace workers about how we actually come up with our own workers plan. I think this really feeds into obviously what Dave Ward was saying at the beginning, is that we need new forms of collectivism, because the whole point of the Lucas Aerospace Alternative Corporate Plan was not just a workers' job defence plan. It was very much anticipating what was happening ahead in terms of the defence sector broadly, and coming up with what you call offensive proposals for alternative and socially, and what we'd probably today call ecologically useful production, and producing the things that we clearly need in society. So, so what's come out of this was actually a whole movement over time, that arguing for that we need the things that society needs, we need the things that our communities need, and that's never been brought into such sharp focus as it has during this period, when we're in such a rich industrial society and yet economy, and yet we can't actually provide the basic things that citizens need, our health workers need, our social care workers need. But I think an important point as well to make in calling for, as we have done through the 2017 TUC motion for a shadow defence diversification agency, which is still very relevant. I think after December 12th, we wondered where we were going to go with that discussion, but that really needs to be put back on the table as part of that wider discussion about where the whole economy will be going and what we want that economy to look like. So, you're stopping me?
No, 30 seconds. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. And what we want that economy to look like, because I think what we need now is to use those ideas from the former Lucas Aerospace workers to develop a new Lucas plan for the whole economy, but one which is based on workers' priorities and our communities' priorities, and not the bosses and capitalists' priorities, which is currently where we are. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sam. A whole series of really important issues raised there. Our next speaker is Amanda Martin, who's the National President of the National Education Union, and people will have seen the important role that the NEU played in trying to get our schools closed down in the first place when the government was dragging its feet, and now they're playing a similar role, trying to make sure that the government doesn't open them before they're safe. Amanda.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, my name is Amanda Martin. I'm the President of the National Education Union. And I kind of want to start by saying I've always been proud to be in the trade union movement and proud of my union. But I have to say, right now, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to represent my union today, not only in the home of the trade union movement in Manchester, but also during this global crisis. And I want to thank and echo the sentiments of every speaker that we've heard today. The NEU is the fourth biggest union in the country and the largest education union in Europe, which is fantastic. But for me, it's not about the size, it's actually about the quality. And this week we've been seeing the week of the worker, I think. We had International Workers' Memorial Day. It's always a day in the union calendar when we remember the dead and vow to fight for the living. And it was even more poignant this year as we took time to remember those that we've lost in this horrendous virus. On Thursday, we clapped our key workers and showed the heartfelt appreciation we have. And May Day yesterday, and over this weekend, we're celebrating and standing in solidarity with all of our workers. What does that all mean for workers, and particularly education workers? I think there's never been a more vital time for trade unions and the amazing role that they play in everyone's lives. When the government announced on the 13th of March that all schools would be closed, apart from to vulnerable and key worker kids, it was pretty much all they said. We agreed it was our members' duty to ensure that schools and colleges should remain open during this time for these people. But we've had to plug that gap of information, of practice and policy to limit the chaos that this government has created. We've added in the details that will protect workers, pupils and our communities, which has meant ensuring those workers in vulnerable categories or the people in, or have people vulnerable in their houses that they care for must work from home. And that has not only protected the NHS, but it's protected themselves. And we've used this with rotas, and we actually believe we've saved lives and we've supported communities and helped keep this country going. We've also ensured that guidance on home learning, home teaching, working with Ofqual to look at assessment, examination, grading has been put out there. We've done supported videos for young people and we've provided information. We've launched a parent website that has hundreds of thousands of hits a day on how they can help their kids at home. And all of this has been in place of government silence. In schools and colleges, our members have provided online and in-school support and paper packages delivering to their homes. While we waited for the information on free school meals, schools put together food delivery services and helped families access those vouchers and signposted them to food banks and other services. We've been in contact with pupils in their homes and ensured the most vulnerable have access to the things that they need. Showing that support, and I think that's shown that supporting education communities and research, real practical advice, calm reasoned negotiations is the way forward, and supporting trade union reps is absolutely the way that we have to do that. Our members' efforts have saved lives. When we first became the NEU, we were dubbed the super union, And I actually think that my members and my employees in the NEU have put their pants and their and their capes on and been true superheroes in this crisis. But sadly, we've lost members in the NEU and members in the profession to COVID-19. People have died through going to work. We can barely contemplate this loss, but as Dave and Jackie said, we will find a way to celebrate them. At the moment, the emotions are linked to a very range of things, from devastation to anger, and yet they're right, there is inspiration. I think this is a time to call workers to action. We've had 600 new reps in the NEU, and we're providing online training and linking them up through Zoom and town halls. Yesterday, we had 900 reps on a Zoom call. But the attacks have begun from those who have no idea what they're talking about. Last weekend, Joe Williamson in the Telegraph told us that teachers should have courage and get back to work. And Adonis called for Ofsted to monitor learning. None of these people live in reality, and we mustn't let them dictate what happens as we go forward and bring down my profession and the education sector. We are courageous, and we are doing our very best to educate the kids in this country. We know that many are saying things through their own ignorance and through trying to get their name in the media, and to cover up their own mistakes. We know some are trying to pitch worker against worker, who needs the most PPE equipment, who needs the most testing, and who should be back in work at first. But we must not let them, because workers for centuries have stood together in solidarity to defend people, and we have to stop them from being negative. History's allowed us to stand on the shoulders of giants, and we now are the giants. Our members and in my union are protecting our kids and our communities, and we need to stay strong. We know that 10 years of austerity have added to this crisis, and we know that this government's indecisions, U-turns and disregard has cost lives. We also know that there cannot be a return to business as usual. This, as you can imagine, there is talk of opening schools. We of course want our kids back in our schools and colleges, learning and thriving and getting the very best, because in the words of Nelson Mandela, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. But we can only go back when it's safe to do so. The NEU have given the government 5 tests they must meet, much lower numbers of COVID cases, a national plan for social distancing, because I'd like to see social distancing in school because it's impossible. Testing, 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 whole school strategies and protection for the vulnerable. But for me, that's not enough. We have to make sure that we're safe, but there are other elements that we have to make sure we do. The curriculum assessment, we have to look at changing that. If Gibbs says that teacher assessment is good for now, then it's good for the future. If creative subjects are dominating curriculum, home learning and in school, then they deserve to be reinstated. If league tables, SAT and Ofsted are gone, then they're gone forever. Education should be holistic and should enrich children's lives. And the third thing we must address in returning is the mental and physical well-being of our pupils and our members. Some kids in this time are going to be blossoming in their own homes, safe, warm environments. But for many, this will not be the case. 4 million kids living in poverty, 1 million homes with no Wi-Fi and no device, no outside space and cramped conditions. Some of our kids would have lost loved ones, and many will be scared, having the news pumped 24/7 into their houses. So we need to ensure that we make a time in this curriculum and a space for their mental and physical health. And when we've made that time and we've integrated it into the schools and colleges day, it needs to stay. Because the future of our country depends on the education, learning, nurturing and pedagogy that our young people receive. This virus is not, as the Tories have said, and as Penny has talked about, a leveller. It's been discriminatory. The virus affects the BAME community and the disadvantaged in such large numbers, and more numbers than it affects the wealthy. And it's not only showing the wide gap, but it's adding to its width. It's not a time for a worker versus worker, but for a time for solidarity, unity, compassion, something I'm so proud to say as National President, my union and our members are showing every day. Comrades, I said at the start, no one should feel isolated in the workplace. No one has to defend their rights alone. The union is the family you choose to join. Please join one today and get involved. Show the value you as a worker have in society. Get support and become part of the debate and part of this absolutely wonderful movement. And on May Day, I want to say thank you to all workers, particularly to our key workers and particularly to my own members. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Our next speaker is Clara Paillard, who's a climate campaign, but also a PCS activist. She's president of the PCS Culture Group and branch secretary at the National Museums in Liverpool. Clara?
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Ian. Hi, everybody. And I am sending May Day love and solidarity to all. As many of you, have been struggling with other reps in the museum sector to protect our members, as we were the first to shut down, and some people are still going in to look after the collections. We all still shell-shocked, not understanding what's going on, but nevertheless adapting. And most concerns about issues other than COVID have been paused or muted, understandingly to an extent, but it is important we start regrouping and organizing, because some issues are very much still here and have been put to light by the COVID crisis, such as the crucial role of the NHS, but also the lockdowns around the world have dramatically reduced CO2 emissions. And the response to the pandemic has also shown that when needed, government can act. They can step in to protect jobs, invest in certain type of productions. Capitalism clearly couldn't cope or act in an emergency. And there is another emergency right now. We must act on climate change. The pandemic must not stop the momentum achieved by the mass mobilization of school strikers and Extinction Rebellion. My union PCS has long been active on the issue of climate and in encouraging other trade unions to play a key role in the response to the climate emergency. One of the first events cancelled before the lockdown was the climate strike in March. In Liverpool, we had just stepped up the involvement of trade union in supporting the strikes, and we were working towards May Day events, bringing together workers, community, climate campaigners. That hasn't been possible. Like climate change, COVID doesn't know any borders and affects everybody. But like climate change, COVID also killed the poorest disproportionately, and it creates mass anxiety in society. So what can the COVID pandemic teach us when it comes to climate change? Well, first, that radical government action is the only possible way forward, but also that acting rapidly to contain is absolutely crucial. It also tells us the virtues of collectivism and solidarity, so that we so need to deliver a just transition to a sustainable economy. So far, China, Europe, and the US are heading for a record 5% annual drop for carbon emissions. Wildlife seems to be thriving again. Waters have been depolluting rapidly. Nearly 8 out of 10 flights globally have been cancelled. The oil industry is in turmoil and the price of the oil barrel has plummeted. Not surprisingly, the climate deniers and neo-fascists are also the ones downplaying the pandemic and propagating conspiracy theory. How we react to the return of normalcy is going to be crucial. Nowhere it should be business as usual, as other speakers have said. Things are still very uncertain, but it's time to adjust our socialist strategy to climate change. Trade unions like PCS have long advocated for the creation of 1 million climate jobs and a just transition. And the Labour Party recently adopted radical policies on climate change, such as the Green Industrial Strategy or the Green New Deal. The Global South and the poorest should not pay for climate change. We must make those radical policies a reality. In December, the COP26 climate talks were going to happen in Glasgow and be the most important climate summit since Paris COP21 in 2015. Who knows what's going to happen now? If the conference will have been held under social distancing, how our response to the COP26 is going to happen from the socialist and trade union movements. So we must restart climate resistance, not in 3 months' time, not in 6 months' time, but right now. People are already dying, not just because of COVID, but also because of climate change across the world. And humanity has shown that we can act. Humanity has shown that we can act for the collective good. Let's continue that path to tackle the climate emergency. Solidarity.
Thanks very much, Clara. In case people haven't spotted it, Norma's posted in the chat box that if you want to speak, as a participant later on in the meeting, please type a sentence or two in the chat box to everybody, not just to the hosts. saying who you are and a summary of your points or question. And please don't try and message hosts privately. We may not see it, so it's best to just do it to everybody. And then one of the co-chairs, Annette, is picking out speakers from the comments people are posting in the chat box. So our next speaker is Joe Grady, who's the General Secretary of the University and College Union, who of course were engaged in a very major dispute just as the COVID crisis hit, and workforce have been struggling to adapt to new ways of working. So I'm sure Joe will have some interesting things to say.
Hi everyone. I think it's fair to say that mass rallies really give us a sense of something more than ourselves. They empower us, they feel special, these events are important. So thank you to Manchester TUC for continuing on with this event. In many ways, I think even if we don't know it as we participate, they teach us what solidarity is and how it feels, as indeed do trade unions. Our entry point into trade unions, I think, is often local, but the working class is international, and our international solidarity with others is so important. Sometimes it even saves lives. And I wondered if I could just talk a little bit historically, actually, about how international solidarity functions and saves lives. Because we're all on lockdown, and I know we've all been watching a lot of TV and box sets. And if you've never watched Ne Passaran, I really encourage you to do so. Now, for those of you who've not seen it, Ne Passaran is a film, and it tells the story of 4 Scotsmen who, along with their workmates, downed tools, and they refused to service and repair engines for the Chilean Air Force that were British-made Hunter Hawker jet fighters. Now, they were politically engaged via their trade union. They realised that the jets that they were servicing and repairing had possibly been used in a violent coup that had murdered so many, and they resolved not to work on those engines. Now, the film explores not just what made these 4 men do this in their factory, but also the enormous pressure that they came under to cease their industrial action. But more importantly, how significant their actions were in depriving the Chilean military dictatorship of much of its air power. And this was contrary to what was being claimed at the time. Following Chile's return to democracy, 3 of the 4 Scotsmen were actually awarded the highest honour which the Chilean government can bestow on foreigners. But the line of the film goes to, and I'm sorry for butchering somebody else's language, but the line of the film goes to Dr. Arturo Giron, who was Allende's personal doctor. And when he was asked to comment on the legacy of the actions of the East Kilbride workers, he said, "The solidarity they showed us demonstrated that we can all live together as brothers and that the world can nurture all of us." Now, I've reflected on this line many times because I think it's a really powerful way to express solidarity. The East Kilbride workers helped people who were very different from them. Despite overwhelming pressure, they refused to stop their action, even though at the time they had little idea or knowledge it was actually making a difference on the ground to the lives of those who the military dictatorship targeted. But it had life-changing and even life-saving consequences for people who they didn't know and who they would likely never know. And that is what all of us are doing right now. You know, we are staying at home, and it's about showing solidarity. We are taking part in collective action in various different ways and recognizing other people's needs. This meeting, and I think speakers on the call, have demonstrated that the trade union movement is at its best when it fights for other people and when it shows others what it can achieve. And this means sometimes, I think, that we are required to fight for things that we don't need. You know, lots of unions have been rallying behind the public sector unions who desperately need PPE. This sometimes means listening to what others have to teach us about marginalised groups and what they need. It means embracing and including groups who, you know, and people perhaps who we don't fully understand and who may be very different. And again, if you'll indulge me, the history of the trade union movement is full of these examples. Many of us know the importance of the relationship between the NUM and the LGBT movement, for example, but It's a story that bears repeating. In 1984, during the miners' strike, the Thatcher government sequestered funds from the NUM, and this essentially rendered it pointless sending donations to the National Union. So obviously groups instead were encouraged to twin with mining communities and make donations that way. So for some of you may know that the Lesbian and Gays Miner Support Group did just this. And this alliance, which was a campaign forged between the LGBT community and British Labour groups, marked a really important turning point. And the NUM in particular began to support and endorse various LGBT events. And in 1985, there was a resolution committing the Labour Party to support LGBT rights. And this was passed due to block voting by the NUM. However, the late, great Tony Benn taught us that every single generation has to fight the same battles again and again. And there is no final victory and there is no final defeat. And it is to that challenge that I want to sort of end my contribution by saying we now have to really ensure that we continue to protect marginalised groups. This means in particular that we protect and support trans and non-binary comrades. The attacks on those people right now is intense, just as it was on the LGBT community in other periods. Also, as we participate in this rally today, we must remember that in the UK, there are workers who are being forced to go into immigration detention centres. You know, they're providing essential services there, such as healthcare and education, but they're providing them to people who should not be locked up in those detention centres in the first place. We really need a different kind of world, and that world has to take as its starting position the words of Allende's physician. There is enough to nurture all of us. Immigrants are not bad or good. Immigrants are all of us. Trans or non-binary people are not bad or good. They are us. Many people are scared of a future that they can't control. Insiders have always been terrified by movements like ours. But our movement has to be progressive. It has to be inclusive, or it will only ever be a movement for a few based on a narrow understanding of what genuine solidarity means, feels like, and in most cases can achieve. I am incredibly proud that UCU is leading the fight on many of these issues. The action that we took, which was mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, was fundamentally about extending solidarity and taking action on behalf of casualised staff who are the most exploited in the education sector, of women and of BME staff and of disabled staff who often suffer incredibly high wage gaps compared to white counterparts. The COVID crisis is particularly in higher education, but also in further education as well, has led to precariously employed and outsourced staff being targeted first as you know, education managers seek to make precarious staff the shock absorbers of poor business models. So I'm incredibly proud that UCU is the union that's leading the fight on these issues. I'm incredibly proud to be here with all of you today. Solidarity and love to you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jo. Some really welcome points. On a personal note, the point about Ne Passaran, a good friend and Unite comrade Sergio Requena Rueda was in one of Pinochet's concentration camps when he heard the news of that action, and he certainly talks about how that saved lives in the camp where he was, just by keeping people's hopes up that people halfway around the world were taking action. So some really important points there. Thanks again, Jo. And our next speaker is Jeremy Corbyn.
Good afternoon, Manchester Trades Council. First of all, greetings from May Day. Thank you for inviting me on, and what a really impressive lineup of speakers you've got. It'd be much better if we were there in the middle of Manchester, but maybe that's for next year. But I also think that these Zoom calls and Facebook events that have been held have probably attracted as many, if not more, people than some of the events we would have held anyway. So maybe next year we can do the open air events, but also do big Zoom events in the evenings, particularly for people who are not going to be able to get along to the rallies. It seems to me that there's a lesson here in inclusivity. May Day is a time of solidarity all around the world. Solidarity with people who are absolutely up against it, fighting for trade union rights. Remember where May Day came from. May Day was a traditional festival of spring, a festival of community and celebration of working class communities. And it became a celebration of protest also, particularly in the United States and other places. And it's now this global event where we express solidarity and support for each other. But it's not even around the world. The effect of the corona crisis is not even around the world. The effect on working class communities of their employment position and their employment rights is not even around the world. The power of global corporations to decide the national economies of country after country are absolutely huge. And one of the big battles we're going to have over the next few months, particularly after the corona crisis has passed its intensity, is going to be about future trade relations between Britain and the rest of the world. Boris Johnson and his government are very keen to do a trade deal with Donald Trump that will be a sweetheart trade deal that will be an attack on the limited rights that we've achieved in this country. And so I think we've got to be ready for that and prepared for that, and not just be defensive, but be extensive about how we deal with things. Because the coronavirus has taught us a number of things. Not so long ago, in the general election campaign, in November and the early part of December, I was being condemned by all of the right-wing papers in this country for wanting to spend far too much money on health, on housing, on education, on taking mail, rail and water into public ownership, and for the green industrial revolution. They even condemned me for the amount of trees that I wanted to plant. It was unbelievable. Then the corona crisis comes along, and the initial response is, first of all, to ignore it, then to give us a eugenics theory, which is of herd immunity, and then finally to get round to doing what they should have done in the first place, which was try and prevent the spread of the virus and then ensure there is treatment available for all those that are suffering from it. And a great deal of money was then found in order to support business, support people to stay in work, and that is the right thing, although there are many, many holes in the strategy, particularly for self-employed workers. And so what I was condemned for wanting to spend money on, i.e. supporting people, communities and public services, is suddenly the flavour of the month. And I'm waiting for an apology from the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph, the Evening Standard, Metro newspaper and many, many others for all that they said about what we did, but I'm not holding my breath. And so I want to deal with a number of issues very quickly, because I'm not sure how long I've got in this contribution, Ian.
You've got a little while yet. Don't stress.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'll let you know when you've got 30 seconds left.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. You're very, very kind indeed. And so let's go through the issues of dealing with the corona crisis first. It was identified in China in last day of December, first day of January, somewhere about that time. The World Health Organization was informed a short time later. They sent out an alert that a novel virus had been found and said to everyone, be careful, be ready for it. They then described it as an epidemic, and a short time later described it as a pandemic. That surely was a warning signal. And when the head of the World Health Organization told us that the way to deal with it was test, 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 finally, the government claimed yesterday they were doing 100,000 tests, albeit with a more than a sleight of hand on the fiddling of figures. And they haven't done the testing. They didn't do the isolation. They didn't do the necessary things in January. They didn't even ensure there was enough PPE equipment in January, and they didn't ensure there were enough ventilators either. And they had a health service that was running at 94% capacity, and more than 1 million people were waiting for access to care homes or some kind of social care. So 10 years of austerity made us unprepared, ill-prepared, and unable to deal with it. And in a crisis, local authorities, councils assume a very great importance, and that's right, they should. That's what they're there for. But they've had 10 years of austerity, 10 years of cuts, 10 years of job losses. Our health service has had 10 years of privatisation and atomisation of its services. So I think the lessons there are that you underfund public services at your peril because they're simply not there when the crisis is on. I want to pay a massive tribute to all those that work in the NHS, in care services, in delivery services, postal workers, train drivers, bus drivers, delivery workers for supermarkets, people that stack shelves, people that clean our streets, all those wonderful people that have actually done everything, done superhuman efforts to keep us safe during this crisis. And what I said at the last Prime Minister's question time I did as leader of the opposition was, who's more valuable in a crisis like this? A hedge fund manager speculating on a future health market or opportunity, or the hospital cleaner, the office cleaner, the person that keeps the toilets clean? Surely they're the ones that really matter at this time in our society. So never again must any Home Secretary describe migrant workers who work as cleaners and care workers as unskilled workers. They're not. They're very skilled, and they've helped to keep many of us alive by their work. And so there's a big lesson here about the kind of society we are and want to be. But there's also something rather unpleasant that's going on. If you look around the world, the effects of the corona crisis have been very, very different in different places. The death rates are spectacularly high in some places, much lower in others, where preemptive action was taken as rapidly as possible. But they're also very unequal in terms of effect of infection and of death rates. And it's poor communities living in the most polluted places, often black and minority ethnic communities, that have suffered the highest rates of infection and of death. And look at the death rates of those that work in the health service and the care service, again, wholly disproportionate to black and minority ethnic communities in our society. And in the USA, Donald Trump seems over keen to lift the measures far too quickly, and has also decided to cut funding to the World Health Organization. And last week in Parliament, a Tory MP, looked like a planted question to me, asked that the British government spearhead efforts to end the World Health Organization and set up something else. Well, I will oppose that, because I think the World Health Organization's principal point, that healthcare should be universal and available for all, is a very good principle. That principle is undermined by many of the world's financial institutions who insist that the poorest and most vulnerable countries institute insurance-based or private health systems within their societies. So that's another debate and another battle that is going on. Post-corona, the world is never going to be the same again. There's going to be a lot of changes. And the horrors of corona have been the deaths, have been the pressure on those that work and those in the health services, and of course those that suffer but hopefully recover from corona. It is a serious, very serious illness and disease. But the other side of it is communities have actually come together in quite an interesting way. I've been helping in all the local food banks in my constituency, and I'm impressed with the volunteers who come, the background and the diversity of those volunteers, and their determination to build a stronger sense of community. So when this corona crisis is reduced, if not completely over, who are going to be the heroes in this? Government ministers that did nothing? Jeremy Hunt, who presided over the privatisation of so much of our National Health Service and now becomes chair of the Select Committee to apparently examine the government's record on this? Or the cleaners, the care workers, the consultants, the doctors, the nurses, all those people that have made superhuman efforts in order to get through this. You and I all know the answers to that. But the other answer cannot be that the financial cost of the corona crisis is huge, no question about that. It cannot be paid for by a new round of austerity and slashing of public services. It can only be paid for by investment for the future, investment in our public services, in a green and cleaner economy, and a recognition that all around the world we actually depend on each other. And so support for the principles of universal health care all around the world. And so there are massive challenges ahead for all of us. And that is what May Day is about. It brings us all together. What it's also about is the future kind of world that we want to live in. And so this May Day, think of all those around the world that have struggled for trade union rights, those who have struggled for land rights, those who have struggled to protect their natural world and natural environment, that have opposed deforestation around the world, that have supported workers' rights. Think also of those 65 million people who are refugees around the world. They're people just like us. They want to make their mark. They want to contribute to our world. And a real solidarity means supporting them. But it also means supporting the General Secretary of the UN's call for a global ceasefire in all conflicts. Maybe we could start by ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which are used to bomb the people of Yemen, and recognize that those in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Libya, in Bangladesh, many other places around the world, are victims of injustice and war. The Rohingya people in camps in Bangladesh, the Iraqi people, the Palestinian people, the Yemeni people, and so many others that are in refugee camps around the world. And as acts of solidarity, let's support the call for the global ceasefire and recognize that when you go to war, as sadly this country did in 2003 with the Iraq War, wars have consequences, and those consequences live on for decades in the lives and the misery of so many people.
Just to let you know,
May Day is also, and I'll finish on this point,
wrap up in the next
time
minute.
of achievement,
Right.
achievement of our movement, of the strength of the labour movement and of the trade union movement. And it's that strength and those principles that will ensure post-corona, the world is not just not like it was before, but we make it a better, fairer place where there is decency for all. It is possible, but it does mean wealth has got to be shared.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. That's great, and thanks to all of the speakers we've had. A fantastic lineup. So just to remind people, participants, if you want to speak, please type something into the chat box, just summarising your point or your question and who you are. And one of my co-chairs is going through the chat box, identifying people to speak and passing those names to me. We've got fairly limited time, so we want to ask everybody to keep to what they say to no more than 2 minutes. In normal times, Manchester TUC holds open meetings every month on different topics where there's much more opportunity for discussion, and we're currently involved, as I mentioned earlier, in the Manchester Workforce Coronavirus Support Group, which has open weekly calls where people are talking about the issues we're grappling with over that. You should also have seen in the chat box, if you aren't on the Manchester TUC email list, anyone can sign up. So again, details posted in the chat. So the first speaker I believe we've got is Greg Dropkin. Are you there, Greg?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, I want to talk about the hostile environment and the charges that migrants are subject to in the NHS and how this relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. But first, let's remember what was wrong with the hostile environment before we got to the pandemic. People will have read these horrific stories of people dying of cancer who were unable to get treatment because they couldn't pay £50,000 for it, because they couldn't prove their entitlement to free NHS care. So it was a human disaster. Secondly, by setting up systems to charge people for healthcare, that undermined the whole concept of the NHS as a universal comprehensive system. If you have a way of checking who's entitled, you can then change that and limit other people's access to care. And so it was a disaster in that sense. The other thing we knew before the COVID pandemic was that it put health workers in a completely contradictory position, because doctors have a duty of care and doctors have the duties of a doctor, and nurses have the duty of care, and the NHS trusts themselves have a duty of care, and there's the Caldecott principles on sharing information. So it was violating the underpinning principles of the NHS were being trampled on by this policy. Now we're in a situation where 2 months after the World Health Organization told Britain that they had to institute contact tracing, the government is finally beginning to talk about contact tracing. Well, how do you do contact tracing if you are also telling a section of the community that they are right to be scared that they're going to be reported to the Home Office if they don't pay for treatment because it isn't free to them? Those people are not going to want to participate in comprehensive contact tracing because they are rightly scared of what is going to happen to them. They're scared that if the test shows that they haven't got COVID-19, they're going to be charged for anything that happens to them in the NHS. They're scared that the Home Office is going to change their immigration status, and that they may end up being detained and deported. So if the government is serious about this, what they have to do is to simply stop the hostile environment in the NHS. They have to do what Ireland, Portugal, and South Korea have done, and just tell everybody you're entitled to free healthcare like everybody else, and we want you to participate in all the public health measures that we're trying to institute. Well, I'm not counting on the government doing that, and that's why what we're trying to do in Liverpool is to take this argument to the NHS itself. If the government is not prepared to stop the hostile environment, then you, the NHS, take it into your own hands and stop it now.
Hi, Greg. Could you wind up, please? Oh, you have done. Sorry. Thanks very much for that. Next speaker is Jackie Burke. You there, Jackie? Can one of my co-chairs unmute her if she's muted?
From Jackie.
Go, Jackie. You're on.
Am I on?
Yes.
Hi. I was trying to unmute myself, but I've been muted by the host. So thank you ever so much for giving me some time to speak. I just want to talk about the tier 1 threat versus the tier 2 threat, and where the money's being spent. And successive governments have identified that pandemics are a tier 1 threat. And yet, the NHS has been massively underfunded, massively underprepared. 100,000, probably 100,000 plus fewer nurses than we need. Poor infrastructure, no spend on infrastructure, nowhere near enough equipment. We all know this. And the nuclear war is classed as a tier 2 threat. Yet the magic money tree has wonderfully and magically borne fruit for the Trident nuclear weapons system. All throughout austerity, and I'm sure through this next round of austerity, the money's been found. The money's been found to spend on replacing the Trident nuclear weapons system. CND reckons somewhere to the tune of 205 billion in its lifetime. So it's really, really important that we bear that in mind, that the money is being found. There is money out there. When they're talking about, when the government is talking about budgets and taking us into austerity and how we've all got to pull together, well, we're not all pulling together. And I just wanted to make that point. I also wanted to say that I know somebody that works on Cygnus, and she told me quite a while ago that all of the work that they did was literally just shelved once it had been produced. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Our next speaker is John Nicholson.
Thanks, Ian, and great speech, Jeremy. Absolutely right about ending the ceasefire worldwide, especially Israel's continued bombing, both within Syria and unremittingly in the Palestinian territories. And I understand the UK's bombed Iraq as well in the last week or so, which didn't seem to get much of the mainstream coverage given the coronavirus. But my question really, which follows on very much from Greg's about ending the hostile environment and specifically the health charges, this virus time gives us the chance to raise some issues that may not have been properly raised before, but we have to seize all those opportunities, in my opinion. And I want to ask specifically, therefore, for a rebuttal of the line, now is not the time, because it is being said that this is not the time to challenge for better pay or for better conditions. It's been said it's not the time to challenge for everything else because we've all got to work together in the national interest. And I want to ask specifically if the Labour Party and the TUC will support workers who take action in respect of pay and conditions and protection at this time, rather than thinking we can just wait for the Tories to come back after the epidemic and then think there's some spirit of 1945 and they'll just generously give us any of that. And would people therefore agree that we should support action that is taken now?
Thanks, John. Obviously, I can't speak for the TUC nationally, but I'm confident Manchester TUC will be supporting workers who take action wherever that is, whether that's in Manchester or elsewhere, if they're fighting to improve their livelihoods and keep public safety. Next up, I've got Ben Clay.
Thank you, Ian, and solidarity, greetings to everyone for May Day. Fantastic speeches and contributions from everyone so far. I'm here to speak on behalf of Tenants Union UK and just to warn people about the coming danger of a massive spike in evictions and homelessness, which could come at the end of the pandemic when the temporary suspension of evictions comes to an end, and when people who have been in insecure work, self-employed, bogus self-employment, zero-hours contracts, who have accrued arrears to their rent, find themselves facing Section 21 notices and Section 8 eviction notices from landlords. We're in a strange situation at the moment where the Tory government came out and made a big show of saying no one should lose their home as a result of the pandemic crisis. Of course, this is just propaganda. What in fact they did was they temporarily extended the notice period for Section 21 evictions, which is what is most commonly used in the private rented sector, to 90 days. That is due to come to an end on the 25th of June. The only reason why all evictions were halted is because the Master of the Rolls and the judiciary took it upon themselves to issue what is known as a practice direction to prevent any further evictions. Now, there's an important case next week in court because, unfortunately, the gears of financialised capitalism never stop, and people...
30 seconds, please, Ben.
Okay, people representing mortgage holders, banks, are challenging this stay on eviction proceedings next week in the courts. They want to be able to evict people for mortgage debts, but that could also range to all people who are currently have those proceedings suspended as a result of the judiciary's actions. So what we want you to do on behalf of Tenants Union and renters everywhere, including many of your members who will come out of this crisis and possibly face these evictions, is to let the government know that this is unacceptable. They have to act now. Don't wait, legislate.
Thanks, Ben.
More evictions, end section.
Thank you very much. So next we've got Dara. Apologies if I haven't pronounced that right.
It's Dara, thank you. So I'd like to talk about the effect that government policies during the pandemic have had on disabled people. I mean, we started with the media saying basically it's okay, only people with long-term health conditions and old people will die. Well, that's very comforting if you're one of the people that refers to. Even now, the government have a list of people who are able to get extra help. So, for example, faster supermarket deliveries or whatever. But as you would expect from this government, it's restricted to a quite narrow set of people. There are a much larger set of disabled people who need the same kind of priority services but are not getting them, and their care provision has been halted. The Coronavirus Act sort of removes the duty of local authorities to provide care under the Care Act. And so I'd like to see the Manchester TUC campaigning for sort of Manchester local authorities to keep on providing the obligations of the Care Act, even though the Coronavirus Act no longer requires them to. Yes, I think that's everything I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. It might be worth you dropping us an email with some more details of what you've got in mind, and let's see if we can follow that up. Next, we've got Christian Gershel. Can somebody unmute Christian?
Hello. Thank you so much. I am delighted and I send my solidarity to everyone. I'm a member of the UCU union. We were on strike last year and at the beginning of this year. I think this is a golden moment for the international union movement. This crisis is a golden opportunity for democratic socialism. The question is, what concrete steps can we take as union members to change the narrative, to challenge the Tory narrative that we are all in this together? We are not. That this is a moment that where a reorganization of society is possible towards a more progressive society. I read somewhere that there are no atheists on a sinking ship. Right now, even the most hardline neoliberal Tory politicians have given up adhering to free market ideology. So we all need to think very creatively about how we can reshape the narrative, about how we can create a better society.
Thanks very much, Christian. Next, I've got Evan Pritchard, but while Evan's just coming on, if anybody else wants to speak, again, if they could just type a couple of sentences saying who they are and what their point or question is in the chat box, that would be great.
Okay. Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. First of all, I think the speakers have all been excellent. What I particularly wanted to do, though, was the comrade Bassam from Palestine. I'd be very interested to hear if he could just say very briefly what the key acts of solidarity with the people of Palestine he feels that we, as people in this country, and particularly as trade unionists in this country, can carry out. And I'd like to thank Unison for having provided the international speakers. But if Bassam could just briefly deal with that, you know, solidarity.
Thanks, Evan. Bassam, do you want to come back in now?
Yes. Okay. Okay, I can. Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I think the main issue, what we want now is, you know, the Israelis continue their policy against the Palestinian peoples, and they confiscate more lands, and every day they are continuing the arrested and so issues. And there is a plan to Israel to annexation more lands during the next 2 months. Besides of this, we have many problems for our workers who are working in Israel. Now, tomorrow there will be about 40,000 or 50,000 workers should go again to work to Israel for 1 month, and they could not come back before this ending of this month. Of course, the Palestinian Authority discussed with the Israelis many measures how to protect these workers there, but we are not trust that they will give them the health protection during this time. And even if there are many problems of our workers, the Israelis policy, health policy, it's not correct, because they bring the workers and push them out to the Palestinian Authority, and without any kind of protection, without any kind even of telling the authority what is the problem with these workers. So now we face now three problems. The Israelis annexation, which is now in the agreement between the new government in Israel, and the other economical and social problems with our people, and of course the third issue is the continuity of the health protection which we needed, because our health system it's very weak, and we need more support from the international health and other countries about this issue.
Thanks very much, Bassam, for coming back to that so promptly. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Next, we've got Fiona from UCU at Manchester University. Fiona, are you there?
Hello, right. Yeah, you're on there now. Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to come in as well as another member of UCU locally in Manchester. Just obviously talk about the fact that we were on strike recently over our disputes on pay conditions and pensions, and the real importance of worker solidarity in that for us, going out in winter, day after day on the picket lines, and the excellent support we got from the Trades Council, and Ian in particular, who kind of took us out to different workplaces and got us speaking to different workers and trade unionists. It was really key to us. And I wanted to talk a little bit about going forward with our disputes. I mean, it's really good to hear from CWU and Dave Ward and how they're managing to actually continue with their disputes during lockdown. And I think we definitely have to be doing that in the universities as well, with all the new attacks we're facing due to the pandemic. And I also want to make a quick point as well. Obviously, we're at the universities. Key to us as university workers in dispute was getting the support from students and finding that incredible support and having students come down to picket lines and joining in with us and doing occupation. That was key to us. And I think going forward, us as trade unionists, we definitely need to be getting together as trade unionists and workers. We also need to be, I think, linking up with other movements, student movements, the climate change movement in particular, other movements that are rising, like the housing movement that we've been talking about. I'm also a member of Social Alternative, like Jackie, who's the first speaker. And something that we've been putting forward is this idea of a conference of resistance, getting everybody together who's going to fight against austerity and actually going forward and making a programme and how we're going to achieve that. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. So I'd like at this point really just to thank everybody for taking part, and particularly thank again my co-chairs who've done a particularly good job at trying to help me look competent despite half the time not knowing what's going on. I think we should all be incredibly proud of our movement and the work that's being done at the moment, saving lives and livelihoods. And at the same time, as Joe pointed out, to keep challenging ourselves that we need to win far, far more to get the kind of world that we need rather than the one that we're saddled with. So to everybody, keep organising, keep campaigning. It's the only way working class people have ever got anywhere. I'm going to end with an opportunity for everybody to be unmuted, to give yourselves and everybody around the world fighting for a better world an opportunity to give everybody a round of applause. So solidarity forever.
Thank you, Manchester TUC.
Capitalism.
Keep it up, June.
Effort for something.
Solidarity.
So I thought, right, well. PP now. That's PP now.